A lot of people talk about Ponzi schemes, but do people really know what a Ponzi scheme is? Stacey?
Well, of course, we've been talking about Ponzi schemes because you can't taper a Ponzi, and that was attempted over the past year with quantitative tightening and interest rates rising. Obviously, that has all fallen apart, especially in Europe, where we have 15 trillion in negative yielding debt. It went up by over 600 billion in one day just in the past week.
I tell you what's remarkable is that, we made a film like 10 years ago about the collapse of Iceland. We went to Iceland about 6 months, 9 months before it collapsed and predicted that it would collapse because it was this huge Ponzi scheme where the banks were lending to speculate, and the result of that speculation in the housing market would be used as collateral at the bank to create more lending. So it became a huge Ponzi scheme. Of course, it collapsed. Now, when people talk about these negative interest rates, they think it's the result of some policy by someone in doing some economic benefit. What they don't understand is that it's the biggest bubble in history. The sovereign bond bubble is by far the biggest Ponzi scheme bubble that's ever been created in the history of the world. This will result in a 98% collapse.
Never in the history of the world until 1971 did the human race ever engage in an all fiat currency commerce trading settlement system. i.e., we've always had gold-backed currencies or some other hard asset. That's why nations went bankrupt all the time. That's why many wars happened, is because France would go bankrupt. They would have no gold left or something like that. So now we have just an infinite regress of ever referring to another contract or another fiat currency printed by something backed by we don't know what, except for perhaps the mightiest army that has ever stalked and threatened the earth. And that's what we have now. So that's why they could go, they believe they could do this.
Fiat currency is referring to other fiat currencies. And that's how you end up with a global Ponzi scheme. And you had, as Nomi Prinz writes in her excellent book, Collusion, about how the central banks then were no longer competing with each other in a mercantilist system, but became their co-conspirators in a global monetarist system, where each bank was simply passing the hot potato around the world. And there was never any moment when interest rates were not being cut over the past 45 years. That's never happened. One country may have raised a bit, but another country would have dropped by considerably more. The net result is now the globe is, the debt to GDP for planet Earth is approaching 350%.
That actually, unlike what you say, banks don't actually lend to businesses. They lend for mortgages. So our entire economy, our financial system, everything is backed by mortgages. So we're going to get to that because here we have Denmark, which Denmark, by the way, is one of the most household indebted of all OECD nations. So their debt to income is 280%. But Denmark's third largest bank is now paying people to take out a mortgage. What this means is that if you buy a house for $1 million and pay off your mortgage in full in 10 years, you would pay the bank back only $995,000. No mortgage payments would be due between the purchase and payoff date. So effectively, a borrower only has to repay principal with a small discount, guaranteeing that the bank loses money on the loan, and that's a negative 0.5%.
Referring back to that film we did about Iceland, and I think it was 2008, about the Ponzi scheme there, Danske Bank was the one who initially put out this report suggesting that Iceland was a Ponzi scheme about to implode. Now in Denmark, as you're pointing out here, they're using the exact same technique of using the hyper-leveraged mortgaged real property assets as collateral to create this enormous Ponzi scheme. So the negative interest rates are a reflection of a Ponzi scheme, not as economic policy. And yeah, you might end up having zero mortgage and the bank paying you 0.5% a year or 1% a year. But let's keep in mind that the value of the property itself, if it drops 50, 60, 70, 80%, that's not a good deal. So they're confiscating wealth from savers and they're giving it to property speculators because the banks have always made their bones in property lending. Their balance sheets are heavy with property, and if they were forced to market the value of that property, they would all have to declare insolvency.
He said, standing at 280% of net disposable income, no other OECD has more indebted households than Denmark. However, that is only one side of the equation, as high debt loads are balanced by large assets, he says, the property.
Right, that's used collateral to leverage a system in an enormous Ponzi scheme. Denmark is the new Iceland. Okay, that's almost a dead certainty at this point.
We're all the new Iceland. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, all of these nations have, they're all relying, just as the revolutionary French did, on basically an assignat. This is what we have, is a global assignat of infinite regress.